Thank you. Thanks for having me back to this wonderful festival.
This project started as a from the very beginning as a collaboration con Bill Frisell. So he didn't score it after you had edited. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis?
Yeah. So, well, Bill had long been a hero of mine musically and also just rhythmically, and I'd used his music to edit earlier films of mine. I first met Bill when I was working at the Village Vanguard as a dishwasher in the early 1990s, and he would come down there regularly, and I sort of sheepishly mentioned to him that I'd used some of his music on a film of mine, and he was like, "Oh, did you ask anyone permission for that?" And I said, "Well, I guess I didn't know about that sort of thing yet." So, but he kind of guided me about the people I should ask, um, and then he came to me and said, "I have a commission for for some new music, and maybe you could make a film that would go with it." And I said, and at that time I was working on this films of The Bells, an old deteriorated print of a 1928 title called The Bells, and I had condensed that title into something shorter called The Mesmerist, and I'd used Bill's music again as sort of a scratch track with the idea that he would rescore it with something original. But then he heard that and he was like, "I really can't think of anything better than the pre-recorded music you already used." So at this point we'd made two films, but they were both with music he'd already laid down. So we'd always sort of made this pact with one another that we would eventually make something where I would make the film anew and he would make the score anew. So in the wake of, well, first, I guess, with Hurricane Katrina, I had traveled down to Baton Rouge to show my films, and a lot of people were talking about, were comparing the 27 flood to Katrina, both meteorologically but also politically. And they were talking about this book, The Great Flood, and I read it and I gave it to Bill, and I said, you know, one of the chapters makes this case that the 1927 flood was instrumental in, of course, is a chapter in the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. But also it makes a case that with the convergence of the emergence of the electric guitar, that it brought folk music and blues up north where it was electrified and became rock and roll. And something clicked with him, and he saw a musical story that he was a part of in this story. And he was like, "Let's do that one." So it was, I guess, right around this time, I had, I had thought, I guess we were working on a project called Shelter, and I had a different artists and a different project altogether, but I'd been looking at footage of, I'd been looking for aerial footage of flood photography from the 20s, and as a way to show some sort of disembodied dreamscape. And I started noticing that it was all this 1927 stuff, and that came from the Fox Movie Tone outtakes that are housed at the University of South Carolina. And so when I went back there, I said, well, let's look at all the stuff, all the flood footage from 26 and 27. And a lot of it hadn't been printed yet. You know, there was just original camera negative, nitrate negative. That so there's a good chance nobody had seen it yet, but we went back to the vaults and scanned it all at 2K, which was the highest resolution at that time. And so we were seeing these images that no one had seen before, and also this decay was embedded in these camera rolls that had actually been in the cameras that had gone down there and floated around on those boats. And so you can imagine that that decay was part of the humidity that actually was the flood. And so that really clean definition stuff that then gets interrupted by this decay, it kind of had both ends of the spectrum. It was at once the most refined photographic image and the most compromised, and that sort of became, you know, the skeletal imagery that I build the film around.
When you started when did you start thinking about the chapters structure, and was Bill also part of that?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of became a default way of working with Bill. Like, Bill really writes. He'll write passages and stuff, but things don't become what you heard until he's in a room with other musicians. And so, as a sort of way of creating a workshop environment for him to write this, we booked a tour, and it was sort of what would have otherwise been an economically unfeasible or untenable tour that started in New Orleans around Jazz Fest, and then it worked its way up the Mississippi River, and this would have been in like 2011, culminating in Chicago. And so I guess we hit like 6 or 8 dates or something like that. And as it turned out, the Mississippi River was cresting, and it was at levels it hadn't been since 1927. Of course, the levees were greatly enforced since then, and had been federalized since then. In the footage you saw, it was just private property that were responsible for their chunk of the river. But we got that vibe, like sitting in Vicksburg and just watching water rise, and just the kind of nervous energy that permeates when there's absolutely nothing you can do except wait and hope that it holds. And then he played a gig in Oxford, Mississippi that night. And I remember that was the first time he broke into Old Man River, and there was kind of this acknowledgement, this big sigh, so from that, Claudia Engelhardt, his engineer, recorded all the concerts and also all the sound checks and rehearsals. And so I just had this tome of footage dealing with this new material that he was writing. And from that, I edited what I thought the arc of the film would be. Even if I had to repeat tunes twice, I gave him an idea of how I thought what we heard and saw would work in a film. And, we went back and forth because I always thought that, I like all the dirges, and he always was adamant that there had to be these kind of humorous interludes, or this kind of Thelonious Monk inspired, upbeat kind of crazy tune that would
for the Sears Reebok.
Yeah, for instance, and for politicians, and these things that would kind of offset, the seriousness of the rest of the piece. And so I learned that from him, and but as a way of working, then I edited his set and then gave that back to him so that we both were working from the same skeleton. I was editing to that and he was rewriting to that. And then I guess as we prepared it for its initial concert at the Cranert and then taking it on tour for the rest of that year in like 2012, we developed it. And the chapters, as getting back to your question, became a way that we could remain in sync, that we would use these different tunes, and each pocket of music would have an associated pocket of imagery, and then I could fade out as they faded out, and then we could hit a title and everyone would reset, and musicians would go on to the next piece of music or change instruments if the case demanded, and we would continue the set that way. So it was really born out of its genesis as a live music performance collaboration. Yeah.
I imagine that because it was born as a live music performance and brought on tour, how different it is, the live performance version from this one, which it's the score that you put in, eventually on a DCP.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing is, it can never sync perfectly in a live situation. So there's little flourishes here and there in this cut version that you might not see in the live that I think, and to my mind anyway, correspond exactly with the imagery and the sound. We don't perform it with trumpet anymore because that cornetist died. So it's really done by trio now. And I don't know. It has a living energy every time. So Bill's adamant that he never plays anything twice. So there's beautiful parts of the score that I just think are amazing. But he just played that in that date in March 2013 in Seattle, and it happens to have been captured on the film. But that was sort of the cleanest recording that there was, where there was no clapping on top of the music or coughing or anything, and it was just a perfect evening. So that is pretty much exactly a live score. So if you were in the Seattle concert, it would be pretty much the same thing, I guess.
You're such a masterful filmmaker. I came here because it's a Bill Morrison film.
Oh, thank you.
And I really appreciate, Giulia, you asking the genesis of this. It was fascinating to see. This is a difficult question to ask, but I know that you make choices as artists do. Yeah. Your audience. I mean, we are an audience that you do think about. And the first chapter, I think, was Sharecroppers. Is that right?
Second chapter, yeah.
I watch a lot of film that's deteriorated. And as I was watching it, though, I was frustrated, I'll be honest, because you stayed on the wash of the water destruction, I realize, of the film for so long that I wasn't seeing anything except that. And I'm just wondering if anyone, I was like, I wanted to see more, even though I was wondering as a filmmaker, you didn't clean it on purpose, because I know what that takes.
Okay, so Sharecroppers is right after that. I think that's just the introduction with the flyover, and then it gets lost in sort of a morass of decay before
It was
we go
after
black.
that.
Oh,
It was after that, yeah.
Let me do a follow up. No, go ahead, Bill, and then I'll follow up.
Oh, I don't know. I use decay a lot in my work, and if you're familiar with my work, you know that. And it always plays a different role. Sometimes it's a character, and sometimes it's a malevolent force, and sometimes it's pure abstraction. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, it really, to me, quite literally represented the humidity of Mississippi. It was the flood itself that was on that. So I think of all these newsreels as vessels of time that have captured not just the image, but something more, and the atmosphere, and a piece of our history, and that it's a somewhat dreamlike vision of our past. It's not a literal or historic vision as much as it is kind of a dream. And there's I like watching it tonight. There's the guy who's just kind of in a daze, who's waiting down the street, and it's almost like he's sleepwalking. And I say this because I understand The Wizard of Oz was shown here this morning, and there's the guys in the boat that are like rowing by, as like in the Twister when the boat's like flying by the window. And so I think of it as it's all part of a cinematic dream that is our. Yeah.
The footage is extraordinary. It's so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
So
Thanks so much.
beautiful,
Yeah.
amazingly beautiful. Just the and I mean your obsession with decay is exciting. It's really great.
Thanks. Well, and sometimes it unifies.
But as a follow up to this part, the balance in the film, which I really love about the film, is that balance where the decay, but there is this revelatory quality of this image. You feel they haven't been seen, So there is that discovery and that desire to see the image in its entirety, and more than in other films of yours that I know, at least.
Yeah, that sometimes is an effect. Is that we're always our eyes are trained to try to find the thing we recognize, and so there's this curtain of decay that sometimes intercedes, and the effort it takes to fix your gaze at the thing that is going to reappear. I think is part of the hypnotism. It's that you're looking beyond it, and then you're sort of getting massaged.
There's a million stories in a silent film. That's what I love.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
First, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
From an historic perspective, was this the Great Flood? Was this the ultimate of the Mississippi River, 26 and 27?
Yeah, this was a big one because 1 million people were displaced, and the country wasn't prepared for it in a certain way. I mean, it's not the ultimate because some people say that Noah was.
What were the causative factors that came together in 26 and 27?
Well, first of all, it was just a lot of rain.
Okay.
It really was. And it was a year of unyielding rain. But like I said, also, everybody was responsible for their own part of the levee. And therefore, you're in competition with the person across the river because if their levee fails, then yours succeeds, So it puts everybody in a dynamic of if another levee fails, then the water goes that way, and you're
So
you're
there
safe.
was no regulation other than local, no state?
Yeah.
When was the first federal regulation?
It came
was that
after
part of
that.
the New
yeah.
Deal?
It came after that.
Was that part of the work?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, you have in 36, I believe, or you have
Was
another
it the Works
flood.
Progress Administration, the WPA?
I mean, it all came out of that.
Yeah.
But it started with that flood because obviously there was a problem,
So the decision to make applied explosive to some of the levee was also like
Yeah, I mean that was rich people in New Orleans saying let's make sure we save the French Quarter, But as the film points out, it was a moot point. But there was also after that the decision to dam all these rivers, and we're only now seeing how foolish that was, and are starting to remove dams because it was it caused a lot of damage to our river system.
Thank you.
April.
I thought it was really beautiful that you more or less started with sharecroppers and then ended more or less with the people pouring out of the church in Chicago, because the film subtext or secondary plot line is certainly the way that you show the resiliency of African Americans. And I thought that was a really subtle, really galvanizing thing to have added to the film, or to have emphasized in the film. So thanks for that. The music was just enrapturing. Hypnotic Films is a really good name for your company.
I'd also just like a shout out to, first our projectionist, Sarah Myers, who's in the booth, who made this DCP from a ProRes file that I sent. And also to your sound system here, because it sounded really good in here.
Yeah, it does.
Thank you. Question back here. Touching on the previous statement about that church scene.
Yeah.
To me, the people, it was a flood of
Yes.
people.
Yeah,
I really love that.
Yeah, a river. Yeah.
A river of people just kept coming and coming and coming. But my question, the music that was during that scene, it sounded just a little hint of Amazing Grace.
Maybe. Yeah.
Do you know if
that's
you
not
based
my
it on-
department,
Not
so.
by your department, okay. But so I thought that was really cool too.
But I agree with that. I can hear that in there. Yeah.
What's that?
It's funny you say that. I heard that.
A little bit, right? And then just separately on the Sears Roebuck scene, like everything in the movie was really, really hypnotically slow, except for that. It was so fast. So obviously you did that on purpose, but it almost, for me, it was too fast because I couldn't really see anything. I would have loved it if it was just slowed down just a teeny bit. But can you explain like what?
Oh
your
yeah.
thought
So
was?
well, again, Bill really wanted to have this dynamic of having something fast and comical interjected in there, and I had read that they said the circulation of the Sears Roebuck catalog's 75 million. And at that time, the population of the country was, probably 150 or something like that. So it was just ubiquitous, this book. And I had read that, you know, a lot of rural households had 2 books, you know, Bible and Sears Roebuck catalog. And I'd also read stories like how it became sort of a dream book for children, you know, to make up stories based on what they read in the book, you know, or and then of course it often got used as toilet paper in an outhouse. So it was really a part of people's life, and it represented for me all the stuff that was lost in the flood, but also all the stuff that people wanted, and the stuff that they finally got when they're coming out of that church. You know, it's an interesting book, 27, because times are still really fat right then, you know, and the country is really doing well, and it's right before the Depression. So there's a lot of manufacturing going on, and people want stuff, and so that book is still reprinted, sort of as emblematic of that time, that pre-Depression high tide, I guess.
I want to ask you about the woman that closes the film. You know, the film goes tight. It has this great panoramic and epic almost mood, and then it goes very, very tight on the guitars and on the hands, and then on this dancing woman.
Well, yeah, I think this woman put it so well. It's about the resilience of African Americans, and you've seen so many people miserable in compromised positions for the last hour, and she was just, to me, so proud and so beautiful, and was looking forward to the way where this music was going, and bringing us to where we are now. You know, so I didn't really know where to cut to after her. You know, she was sort of a muse. You know.
That was from the 1960s, though.
Yeah. So that got us up to the 60s. You know.
Any other question? One.
I think the chapters work really well with the music and on their own. I had worked on a documentary where we had chapters on a cowboy, and Earl Scruggs and his sons did the music.
Oh, wow.
And it worked out really well like that. And it was,
What was that?
it was in the 70s, 1976, called Spike, the Montana Horseman. Please look it up, and maybe you can get it shown. It's a short film, and it's really wonderful. But it had that kind of flow with, and I appreciated the chapters because it really kind of defined where things were. We had narration too,
Right.
from the principal cowboy, but
Well, yeah, that's also the chapters allowed me to interject a little bit of context and some historical fact, not too much, but
Geography.
no, it was very hopeful too.
Geography is important, as always in your film. Yeah.
Thank you.
thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and most of all, thank you, Bill, again for being.